Welcome everyone to our webinar. We're talking about protecting your employees' mental health and your new obligations. My name is James. I'm a practice group leader in our employment team here at LegalVision, and I'm joined by my colleague Atticus. He's a lawyer in the team. Before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. So you're going to be emailed a copy of this webinar, a recording, and of the slides. Throughout, feel free to submit any questions that you've got in the chat box there. We will do our very best to get to all of them at the end, so there'll be time for questions at the end. Any questions we don't get to, you've got an opportunity as well to chat to us at another date. I'll talk about that in a minute. But otherwise, there'll also be a survey. We would really love it if you could please do fill out that survey. It's really helpful for us to collect all the feedback we can. We want to make sure these webinars are as useful as possible for you. So please do, if you can take a moment to respond to that. As I mentioned, all attendees here are eligible to receive small to medium business legal health check with us. That's so you can identify any sort of gaps in your legal compliance. If you want to request that health check, just provide us with the contact details in the survey that I mentioned, and that'll all appear at the end of the webinar. Okay, so today, what we're going to be discussing, we'll talk about an overview of your obligations. We're going to talk about mental health risks, what drives those risks, and then finally some key tips for compliance. And as I mentioned, there'll also be a chance for us to answer some questions. So as I said, please submit those questions through the chat function. I'll try and get to them at the end. We'll just get right into it. There's plenty to cover. I'm going to start off talking about your WHS obligations. So in Australia, model WHS laws were developed by Safe Work in around 2011. Every state and territory has the same law, same obligations, except for Victoria. They haven't yet adopted the same laws, but in essence, the obligations are quite similar. WHS laws impose duties on a person conducting a business or undertaking. So that's a PCBU. We're going to talk about those obligations. Then officers, your senior managers in your business, and then workers. PCBU is basically any kind of business. It's sole traders, it's companies, partnerships, unincorporated bodies, associations. When we're talking about psychosocial risks here as part of this webinar today, psychosocial risks have always been covered by the WHS laws. They've always been a risk to health and safety like any other. Recently, however, there have been some amendments to your WHS regulations, and including in Victoria as well under their laws, to basically expressly reference psychosocial risks as something that businesses need to address. So safety regulators are also turning their focus on these risks. More and more, the statistics on workplace injuries are showing up non-physical injuries as the prevalent ones, rather than historically where we were mostly talking about physical injuries. So we'll work through those obligations that I mentioned. A PCBU, this is, you call it your business, call it the company. It has a primary duty of care to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers and others in the workplace. Basically extends to providing and maintaining a safe workplace, safe plant, structures, systems of work, safe use and handling of all your plant and structures, making sure you've got adequate facilities for the welfare of your workers, providing information, training, supervision that's important or necessary for keeping a safe and healthy workplace, and then monitoring the health and safety of your workers. The critical aspect of this obligation is how far do you have to go in relation to keeping a safe place of work. Now, the obligation there is to do what is reasonably practicable. That basically means that a small business might need to take different steps from a large corporation. or it can mean that some risks need to be fully eliminated where others you may not actually need to do anything about. So keep that in mind as we're working through these psychosocial risks today. The factors that are sort of relevant in determining what's reasonably practical or what you really need to do about responding to safety risks and hazards, the likelihood of it occurring, the degree of harm that might arise from the actual risk you're responding to, and what you actually know about the risk. So risk which you don't actually know anything about, or there aren't really any guidance on how to respond to it, obviously changes the extent to which you can implement control measures. What's available in terms of how you can respond to risk, how you can eliminate it or minimize it, and then of course the cost which is associated at getting the risk down. So they're the things to think about for the business as a very broad overview of its obligations. We'll now move on to the senior managers in a business. So these are called officers. Officers are basically people who make decisions that have a substantial impact on the business. They're your senior managers. They might be maybe your C-suite executives. Officers have their own specific obligations in their personal capacity under the WHS laws. They basically need to acquire and stay up to date with WHS matters, so they need to educate themselves and keep, remain across changes to the law, updates in processes and procedures that are industry or standard practice. They need to know what hazards and risks are associated with the business. They need to make sure that the business itself has adequate processes and procedures and resources in place to manage those risks. And they also need to ensure that they've got the right reporting processes so they can actually handle incidents, I guess, a process to improve, on their processes, making sure that when there are incidents, there are mechanisms to make sure they don't happen again. Finally, then, workers. So workers, basically anyone who's performing work for a PCBU. It's a very broad definition. Could be an employee, contractor, apprentice, a trainee, could be volunteers. WHS laws also impose obligations on those workers, and they've got to look after their own health and safety, and they've got to look after the health and safety of others who might be affected by what they do in the workplace. They also have to comply with the instructions of the business and cooperate with any of the policies that might be in place. So that's a whirlwind look at the obligations, but it's really important to understand those three duty holders anytime we're talking about WHS obligations on the company, on the senior officers in the business, and then on the workers themselves. Knowing and keeping in mind those obligations at each of those levels, it's then worth taking a look at how to identify risk in the business. And this is critically something for the business itself, so the PCBU and the officers. Specifically here, we're talking about psychosocial risks. So this is where we'll get into the meat of actual psychosocial issues. And for that, I'm going to hand over to Atticus now.
Thanks for that, James. And in the context of understanding the obligations that do exist at law, it's important to acknowledge the growing number of claims that have arisen from a mental health perspective. When we talk about mental health hazards and the associated risks that do exist in the workplace, it's necessary to understand what each of these individual terms mean. And as you're probably aware, a workplace simply means any place where work is carried out by a worker. But what this means is there could be different workplace locations for an individual worker based on the different types of work that they may perform. WHS hazards refer to anything that can cause harm in that context, while the risk itself means the possibility of that WHS hazard or that harm occurring if the worker is exposed to a WHS hazard. Now, in the context of mental health risks, they're often referred to as psychosocial hazards. They're effectively non-physical risks, if you like. They're things such as, bullying, harassment, not having the adequate support in a job or the control that a worker would typically need. These sorts of things create psychological harm. For example, anxiety, depression, PTSD, or sleep disorders. And this is what we refer to, generally speaking, as psychosocial hazards. These sorts of hazards at work are aspects of work and situations that can cause these sorts of stress responses, and they can lead to both psychological or physical harm for workers. On average, work-related psychological injuries, they have much longer recovery times, higher costs to deal with, and often require more time away from work. And what that means in practice is that managing these risks associated with psychosocial hazards not only protects workers, it also decreases the disruption associated with staff turnover and other things like absenteeism. But most importantly, it can improve broader organisational performance and productivity for a business as well. The common psychosocial hazards that do come up include things like job demands and high workloads. And for example, what this could mean is things like insufficient time and or resources to complete a certain task, whether or not a worker has the tools that they need to actually do their job properly. Things like exposure to emotionally taxing work, particularly over a longer period of time, or having to deal with unachievable deadlines or expectations or the like. In terms of low job control, this could include where a worker has very little control over how they actually perform the work that they need to do, and when those tasks need to be performed, or how variable they are, and when they can take breaks. In terms of poor support, this is particularly from the context of managers or supervisors, and could include things such as receiving unreasonable feedback or not being provided with adequate information or resources that would be relevant to that context. Other examples of common psychosocial hazards include a lack of role clarity, poor organisational change management, particularly with the current changing nature of work, inadequate reward and recognition for the roles that are being performed, certain traumatic events, perhaps remote or isolated work. For example, when there's no immediate access to colleagues or supervisors where assistance is required, or perhaps being alone in the event of an emergency. Other hazards can include things like violence and aggression, which unfortunately do occur in the workplace. Things like bullying, discrimination and harassment, as James touched on earlier, and conflict or poor workplace relationships and interactions that can happen from day to day in the workplace. After identifying the risks that exist, it's important to conduct a risk assessment. And the things that you need to consider are in the context of, as James mentioned previously, what is reasonably practicable. Now, the considering factors that should be taken into account include duration. So what we're talking about there is how long and also how likely is the worker exposed to these risks. This, of course, is in tandem with frequency. How often is the worker exposed to the risks? Is it actually that frequent, or is it not so frequent at all? In terms of severity, how severe are the risks, the risks that the worker is actually exposed to? It may not matter if we're talking about risks that are extremely short in duration or very infrequent, if the risk itself is incredibly severe. In terms of the damage that will occur from these, these sorts of risks, it's important to consider if someone is, a bit stressed because they have a deadline looming or something like that. That would be considered usually as a normal part of work. It's not something you need to fundamentally change the way in which your business works, or requires an immediate need or response. However, conversely, if we're talking about someone who is chronically overworked, and they're stressed because their role requires them to produce consistent work at very high pressure deadlines with extremely difficult clients, well, we may well be talking about there a different situation that will require steps to make certain organisational changes to respond to this type of environment. And I think on the basis of that explanation, it's worth taking a look at what the actual drivers are of these risks in the context of psychosocial hazards. So there's many aspects of a business that can create these psychosocial risks, but typically they can come from a sort of broad series of areas. But firstly, we can discuss the design or management of work. What I'm talking about there is the way in which individual tasks are actually designed, or the job as a whole is designed, and how the task and the jobs are organised and supervised from a day-to-day basis. In terms of the work environment, are there psychosocial hazards and risks that are particularly inherent to that task or to that role? This could obviously be industry specific, but it's important to think about that in a way that are there inherent risks that come part and parcel with that role. In terms of the plan, or otherwise referred to as equipment, the working environment, or the need to undertake duties in environments that are particularly hazardous. Again, this may well be industry or job specific. And in addition to that, the sort of more social elements of day-to-day work. This could include things like workplace relationships or other social interactions, whether it be between colleagues or between fellow workers, senior managers, clients, or other people who you interact with as part of the day-to-day part of your role. On that note, I think I'll hand back over to James now to talk through some of our key tips to comply with your obligations.
Okay, thanks, Atticus. So yeah, look, broadly there, we're understanding that these risks can actually come from the structure of the role. It can come from the nature of the work that your workers are actually doing, and they can come from your sort of organisational design as well, and cultural elements within the business. It then becomes, because a lot of those issues, some of them are obvious to identify, others not so. Then a question of actually considering, all right, well, what do we do? How does a business go and respond to these issues, now being aware that they probably exist? Number one is conducting an assessment. So think about whether your workforce is actually overworked. Are they unsupported? Some of this might actually just be evident to you in the sense that it's a legitimate strategy for a business to consider these risks by just observing them. If you can identify them by simply thinking about your business, that can be sufficient. Other aspects of them you might actually need to explore in depth to uncover whether or not there are actually issues. And you can do that through consultation, which is something we'll talk about. Identifying your risks in the workplace involves really finding things, situations, well, what can cause harm to people? As we know, when it comes to your psychosocial risks, they're generally arising from things like the physical work environment. So that could be an issue like, can your workers actually extract themselves from difficult situations? So, for clients joining us in the retail space, where that might be a common issue, are there any processes in place? Does the physical space actually allow for a worker who might be, facing a risk from an aggressive or difficult customer to extract themselves if they needed to, if that was such a risk that it was important they should be extracted? Equipment, materials, and substances that they're using. So even things like loud noises and vibrations in your workplace can create psychosocial risks. So have a think about whether that workspace, the materials, the substances you're actually working with are posing a risk. Think about the work tasks and how they're performed. Now, typically, if you bring that back, say maybe to a business, to an office-based environment, think about workload and how that's designed. is there a way that you can ensure that some employees, aren't being redlined, while others aren't actually doing much at all? So really solid capacity management is something where you'll be able to identify a lot of risks. And the work design and your management structures. So have you got a structure in place to ensure actually that the safety of your workers is being managed? Do you have a WHS compliance team? Do you have a WHS manager? Do you have policies in place that have mechanisms for workers to raise issues when they have them? Finally, you're going to want to implement your controls. That is, do something. Your business needs to be taking some steps to eliminate or minimize the risks. If we turn over, want to talk specifically about how you can actually identify risks. So what we're previously discussing there is, well, where can all of those risks come from? How can you actually go and identify them? So number one, you can go and inspect the workplace for hazards. You would be doing this for all of your non-physical hazards, but you can also do it for the psychosocial hazards. As I said, some of those can actually come from the physical workplace design. Consultation, so consulting workers, consulting your suppliers about health and safety issues. This is critical, and I'll touch on this a little bit more. Research, so review the available information about and advice about hazards. So Safe Work now puts out a lot of information about managing psychosocial risks in the workplace. There is a wealth of information online. That's before you go and even start looking at their specific guides or their codes of practice, or go and take specialist advice from a consultant. So there is plenty of information, and Safe Work is a great place for you to get it, just to educate yourself, your senior managers around non-physical risk. Now, consultation, these last 4 points here is sort of critical. Actually talk to your employees about their clarity about their role, how they are going. Having dispute resolution mechanisms that work, that employees feel confident that they can use. Make sure there are policies in place, and that they're not just sitting in the top drawer, having been forgotten about. That, one day years ago, someone got in touch with a lawyer and said, we need to tick a box on policies. That's great. But if they're not being administered and they're not being properly disseminated and enforced and complied with from everyone in the business, then they become useless. Now, you need to make sure that that you're actually creating an environment where your employees are comfortable raising their concerns. All of your compliance, I think, really turns on two issues, and it's leadership and consultation. Leadership in this space is really best achieved, we think, by ensuring that your managers are actually aware of their duties under the WHS laws. So where they understand that they've got obligations in their personal capacity, remembering that their obligations are effectively to make sure that the business can comply, and that they themselves need to stay up to date on WHS issues. They're their sort of primary obligations. Where they understand that they might have these obligations in their personal capacity and be personally liable if they don't comply with them, they tend to engage a little bit more comprehensively with these issues. And your engaged leaders, that tends to drive engaged workers. And yeah, it really can be the drivers of positive culture in a workplace. That's a very good starting point for it to come from. Consultation, it's a requirement under the WHS laws. And that can be quite simple when it comes to managing physical risk in a workplace and seeking feedback or input from workers around physical safety. Well, that can be quite uncontroversial. When it comes to psychosocial risks, and there are certainly challenges for businesses here in the consultation space, but it is still critical that you do it, A, because you're obliged to at law, but B, because it's a real driver in actually then ensuring that everything we've talked about today can be raised and then dealt with. Consultation with psychosocial risk can be problematic because the nature of these risks can quite often be personal, they can be private. Sometimes they're sort of attached to some kind of stigma. It means there's often hesitation from a worker perspective when it comes to discussing it. So to combat that, consultation for your non-physical risks might be things like toolbox meetings, your town hall meetings. We'll just get everyone in a room and we'll talk about it. Well, people are less comfortable doing that around mental health issues. But you absolutely can consult by doing things like surveys. You can do anonymous surveys. You can have small group meetings. You can create a WHS committee and have them deal with a very specific meeting. You can deal with your consultation obligations through catch-up discussions, one-on-one, managers just chatting to the people that they're managing, so that there is a consistent opportunity for people to raise these issues. And that's going to typically be your best way to do it. So, as I said, I think this boils down to leadership from your managers, and then ensuring that you're consulting. That's your best way to understand whether there are issues in the workplace, and then to create your effective strategies to make sure that you're managing those risks. All right, I know there's been a lot to cover, and this whole topic can really blow itself up in any of those areas into a lot to go through, but hopefully that's useful in terms of at least scratching the surface on these issues and what you may need to do. That concludes the main part of our webinar, and we've got a publication which you might find useful, which is your safety essentials for small to medium enterprises. You can download that via the handout section in the webinar panel. We've also got another upcoming event which might be of interest. It's managing employee sickness and absence on the 27th of April, and there's the link there. You can register for that one. We will get to your questions shortly, and in the meantime, while you're submitting them, we just want to take a minute to talk about the membership. LegalVision's membership, it's effectively a cost-effective alternative to what could be expensive hourly rates that you might experience with other law firms. For an affordable monthly fee, you'll receive cost certainty and an all-inclusive legal service. That includes your unlimited document review, including drafting, amending, reviewing business and employment contracts, unlimited advice consultations. We've got a team of 100+ specialist lawyers. We cover things like business structuring, employment advice, disputes, and more. And unlimited domestic trademark registration. Our members can also subscribe to our WHS advisory service, where we provide specific advice and assistance that's going to help you meet your WHS compliance obligations. So in relation to things like we've been talking about today with your psychosocial issues, but also all of your WHS obligations more broadly. The membership is like having your own in-house counsel. We'll take care of all your business as usual legal work so you can focus on running your business. If you are joining us as in-house counsel, then the membership is a cost-effective solution for outsourcing any additional legal work. If you want to learn more about the membership or how we can help you, you can just request a free consultation when the survey appears at the end of the webinar. And we'll move on now then to some of your questions, which I'll just pull up here. Okay, so how will you know when there is an issue with your employee's mental health? What are the signs to look for? It's a really good question, and the answer's quite difficult. The signs can obviously be hidden. Typically, they present as things like burnout, so sometimes extended absenteeism can be part of it as well. That can be a sign. They can otherwise just be things that you might recognize in relation to people's mood or general behavior. And of course, they can be entirely hidden because many people struggle with mental health issues, and no one is any the wiser. That's why I think critically the consultation piece becomes really, really important for businesses. You're not always just going to be able to observe these issues like you can observe other injuries in the workplace. And so because they can be so difficult to identify, it becomes really quite important to make sure there's a mechanism where people feel like they can actually just tell you what's going on. Where you can't identify them, obviously, fostering a culture where people can put their hand up and do so comfortably. So whether that's anonymous surveys, whether that's one-on-one conversations with trusted managers, those are probably your ways that you're going to have the best outcome of someone feeling like they can raise it. Okay, so protecting employee mental health in a virtual or work from home organization. Another really interesting question. So they're all the same obligations apply, even when there's no physical office. And the online interactions, as far as the law is concerned, is all treated exactly the same as, say, your interpersonal interactions in an office. It's really then about monitoring again, and then ensuring that you've got an environment where people can raise their issues. Being entirely virtual, being entirely online, it makes it even harder for an employer to identify whether there are psychosocial hazards or there are psychosocial injuries arising from any of those hazards. So again, the consultation piece becomes critical. I suppose it's also a good time to point out, and coming back to that initial obligation on a business, is to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, your workers' health and safety. And there's probably the important message in relation to that obligation is that you don't have to eliminate every single risk in your business. It's not an absolute obligation. So where an employee is giving you no signs, where an employee is responding positively to every survey, where an employee has, a job which is not ostensibly one which would overwork them, or create any significant risk to their health and safety, where you've got a business where you have a strong culture and you've got policies in place to make it very clear what conduct is and isn't okay in your business. Where that person then does suffer some kind of injury, just because there's an injury, it doesn't mean then that the business has failed and it's breached its WHS obligations and that it's going to be prosecuted by Safe Work because it didn't make sure the environment was safe, or it didn't eliminate whatever particular risk it was that caused an injury. So all of those factors, for example, in this instance, like being a virtual or online organization, would be taken into consideration in terms of how far you can go to manage these issues. But the critical piece is you've got to be doing something. So you've got to have a consultation mechanism. You've got to have work health safety policies. You've got to make sure that employees have the option at some stage to raise issues, and that you've got a culture, even though it's an online organization, a culture where people who do raise issues are not victimized or somehow going to suffer some other kind of detriment because of it. So, but it's certainly something that gets taken into considerations. Our company works within the aged care and disability sector. We have experienced a few deaths of our participants, clients. What types of support should we offer to our staff? Yeah, so look, quite specific in terms of the issues that those workers would be facing. A common approach for those types of things is having an employee assistance program. So employee assistance programs are usually things like some of them are just virtual, or it's access to a certain number of counselling sessions. with with those types of things, yes, certainly that would be a traumatic experience, albeit one that people moving into that sector may expect as part of their role. But again, having some kind of support available, then now that can start with things like you can have a conversation with your manager about the things that might be troubling you. We can promote and encourage time off when you've been going through a difficult experience like that, or it can be going into something more formal, like we bought a subscription to an employee assistance program. Here are the contact details. You can make use of it if you want, but it's going to be a certain number of counselling sessions. It could be, for example, sure, if that was too much, for example, if it was going to be extremely expensive and your organisation didn't have the means to go and get an employee assistance program, it might just be about sharing with those workers materials that again, they're probably materials published by SafeWork. I don't know whether there are any on that specific issue, but general mental health management tips. It could be things like letting them know what types of support services are available from the government in relation to consultations with psychologists or anything like that, and encouraging and assisting them to do that. All of that again comes back to this obligation around what is reasonably practicable for your business. So, very large business, the expectation is, well, and you've got the means, you should be getting an EAP. That's an easy step that you can take. Whereas small business, limited means, potentially doesn't need to go that far. All right, let's have a look at some of the other questions that have come in here. Yeah, does the legislation take heed of the fact that some workplaces are inherently stressful? Yes, it does, is the answer to that question. It absolutely, this comes back to your obligations around doing what's reasonably practicable in light of what the job is. And yes, inherently stressful workplaces, potentially by nature of the people who go into them, less likely to suffer. It doesn't mean, however, that you can do nothing and say, look, just because you work in this particular industry, you need to accept that there's going to be stress, and therefore we're not going to do anything about it. You still need to have a process in place to make sure that even if you can't eliminate the risk, and again, this is your obligation. If you can eliminate the risk, eliminate it. But if you can't, and in some industries, you cannot eliminate the risk of stress. In fact, in most jobs, you cannot eliminate the risk of stress, and stress is a risk from your job demand. It can't be eliminated, but can you minimize it to the extent to which is reasonably practicable? So just because it's a stressful industry doesn't mean we just need to accept that in its entirety, but can we put something in place to bring it down a little bit? And that's what the law wants you to do. So yes, it's not an absolute obligation which says there can't be any risk, and certain industries, of course, are going to have those risks. How would you go through a performance management process with an employee who has advised their employer that they are struggling with severe mental health issues? Yeah, that's a good question. So, and something which comes up a lot, sometimes because employees have genuine mental health issues, and unfortunately sometimes that's a place where employees go to hide when they realize they're being performance managed. In that instance, you really do need to try and separate what's a performance issue and then what's a health and safety issue. Now obviously they're very very frequently joined, because often the poor performance is driven by the poor health. Step one is usually where you've got genuine concerns about what you're going to be doing with that employee is to figure out whether they are actually fit for work. Now, if, for example, going through a performance management process when someone's dealing with severe mental health issues is not something they can actually handle, then it may well be the case that this person is just not fit for work, meaning that they need to take sick leave. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be liable as an employer, and I suppose there's probably an important thing to consider here. When we talk about WHS obligations, your safety obligations at law, this is different to workers' compensation. So if there was an injury, two things can happen typically. Number one, if you have an injury at work, the employee can make a workers' compensation claim. They ordinarily, subject to the severity and whether there's any negligence, they ordinarily would just have their medical bills paid for by your insurer, and they would have their wages paid for by their insurer while they return to work, and the insurer tries their best to get the person back to work. That's a no-fault insurance jurisdiction, so that employees don't sue their employers when they're injured at work. The only effect to your business is that your premiums will go up. The WHS obligations are enforced by safety regulators, so WorkSafe, Safe Work, in all the different jurisdictions. They would typically, they could, they don't always, but could come and investigate, and they would be the ones who would make an assessment of, okay, well, an injury occurred. Did you take reasonable steps, or did you ensure, to the extent to which is reasonably practicable, the health and safety here? Now, if you've done enough and the accident or injury is not actually something you could have prevented, then you'll be off the hook. And that's why everything we're talking about here is making sure you're doing something. So from that liability perspective, it's always about, well, have you taken steps here? So if you bring that back to an employee with severe mental health issues, yes, number one, are they actually fit for work? Can they perform this job? If they had a broken leg which they couldn't stand on and their job required them to, work on a building site, well, they wouldn't be coming to work. Same deal. Performance management is part of work. If they can't be subjected to it because of their health, they're not fit for work. So that can be assessment number one, which you can either ask them to get that information from their doctor if they're going to provide it, or you can direct them to attend a medical assessment, or just have that conversation with them and see if there's an alternative. In most instances where we're talking about things like workers' compensation, or in relation even to bullying claims, there's an exemption for reasonable management action. So where an employer has carried out reasonable management action in a reasonable manner, then, for example, that it's unlikely the employee can be successful in a workers' comp claim. So the law does understand that you need to be able to manage your workers, but you do have to do it in a reasonable manner. So have regard to their health in that process. So it's probably tricky to answer that one in a broad sense. If you've got a specific issue, definitely book in with us. And there are a lot of questions here. I'll do one more which just kind of relates to that. Can employers ask employees to provide proof, say things like medical certificates? The answer there is yes. So an employer can, if an employee wants to be on sick leave, they do have to provide evidence. Typically, a doctor's certificate is considered reasonable evidence, but the obligation is to provide reasonable evidence, or evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person that they're actually sick. So there is an ability for employers in these situations to actually say to people, I need to understand whether you can safely perform this job. So where someone's demonstrating, serious and ongoing mental health issues, you are allowed as an employer to have the conversation with them and say, look, we've got to keep you safe at work. And so we need to make an assessment of whether you can actually safely do this role, and we can get a separate professional expert third party to make that assessment. All right, now I'm sorry for everyone we haven't been able to answer their questions. As I said, please make use of the booking if you want to have that conversation with us. that's all the time that we have for today. When the webinar ends, a survey is going to pop up. We'd really appreciate it if you can complete that one, put your contact details in there, and you can receive the complimentary WHS legal check, so we can have a look at in a general sense at what your safety compliance levels are. And other than that, thank you so much for joining us today.